So there's a couple reasons why I've been thinking about this topic in particular. There was an OC micro trend going around for a while where people would show their canon OC and how they think fandoms would misinterpret their character, which was a really cool thing, and I want to see more posts about how OCs or people's original characters would be in a hypothetical fandom. But I was also just talking in general about fandoms and how they often misinterpret characters with a couple of friends, so I just wanted to do a little ramble on some of the fandom tropes and common reoccurrences that I see from my time being in a bunch of different fandoms, and how some of them are more on the lighter side and not as serious, and slowly go into some of the ones that are a little bit more eyebrow raising at best. Okay, first off, for those who don't know what Fanon means, I guess the best way I could put what Fanon is when a fan-created concept and trait for a character becomes widely accepted and more often than not overlaps with canon and causes direct discrepancies. Misinformation is really easy to spread in fandoms, and oftentimes fan interpretations get so popular that it's easy to mess up with canon, and people often mistake it for canon sometimes, and that causes a lot of discourse in fandom. And so I'm just going to go down the list of a couple things that I see the most, I think, in fandom when it comes to characters. So the first one that I want to talk about is Flanderization, and I think I have to explain Flanderization too, for people who don't know. It comes from, I think, Ned Flanders from The Simpsons, and how specific parts of his character were overemphasized over time to the point that that was all his character was. Technically, Flanderization is mostly for the writers or script writing aspect, but I think it applies a lot to fandom too, because oftentimes they'll take specific traits of a character and amplify them so dramatically that it becomes basically their only defining feature. I think the best example of this that I can think of in my experience was definitely Underswap Sans. It got to a point where there's just two different versions of this character, which is like the Fanon Flanderization of that character and, you know, the one that's closer to its original counterpart. Basically what happened with Underswap Sans is there was a lot of different ideas on how to make Underswap closer to Papyrus. Like, instead of it being, spaghetti, they associated Underswap Sans with tacos, and that got so amplified for a period of time. One of my first email accounts has that exact phrase, or a phrase that's alluding to the Underswap Sans and tacos thing. It's so embarrassing, but it was common for this character, who is a fan character, mind you, to kind of be whittled down to those specific character traits, and I noticed this exact pattern with a lot of the Undertale characters. I think it's a lot different now, and a lot of people have matured over time. Characters in Undertale were kind of whittled down to some of their more basic character traits, because I can remember a lot of fan content where Papyrus was labeled a naive, unable to do anything on their own type of person. They also latched onto the idea that Papyrus hated puns, when in canon he's made a lot of really bad ones himself. It happened in the opposite sense for Sans, because a lot of people focused on his more self-aware attribute, and that became like the most defining feature for him. Like, you cannot go really far in the fandom's history without finding something to do with the gritty self-awareness of being in a game and everything. When I think in canon, Sans does have that attribute, and it is a part of his character, but I think the fandom, again, amplifies this a lot. And I think I reiterate again that I feel like the Undertale fandom has matured a lot from its original state that it was in years ago, and Undertale's like 10 years old now, so a lot of people who were involved in that fandom have just kind of grown, and so a lot of the original traits of all of these characters are sort of seeping back into them. I'm noticing the same patterns with the Deltarune fandom and levels of Flanderization creeping in there. But yeah, I think fandoms in general have a tendency to focus on specific traits of a character and then over-exaggerate them to the point that that's literally all of the content of that character in the fandom space. Moving on to the next one that I want to talk about, and this one was a little bit difficult for me to describe. I've just settled on the term do no wrong, which is like smoothing a character down and trying to excuse actions, and I see this most with antagonists, but when people gravitate towards antagonists, or like antagonists in general, they often want to excuse the actions that that character takes in order to feel like they aren't a bad person for liking that character. And to be clear, I don't think anyone's a bad person for liking an antagonist or a character who does morally bad things. It's a bit silly to feel like you have to excuse a character's many misdoings in order for you to like them, because you can like a character and not agree with the many bad things they do. But I think it's kind of counterintuitive to like a bad guy and then say, oh, but this caused all of them to be like this. It's actually the fault of everyone else and not the character themselves, because it removes the agency of that character. It also removes a lot of the grit and initial charm of a character and smooths them down to more of a innocent sort of figure, which is what I mean by smoothing them down and doing no wrong, because they feel like this character can't do any wrong because they've been wronged in their past experiences and everything. With other characters too, this is a level of infantilization where, you know, they just can't do anything wrong ever. Again, I do notice this the most with antagonists or characters who take bad actions. I say again, it is completely fine to like a character who is evil. It's okay to like evil characters. And I think it's even worse to be sort of dismissive of those evil actions that the character takes. Because I'm sure that yes, that character you're talking about was wronged at some point in their life, but at some point that action is their own. And I don't think this is anything like harmful or too bad. The more we go down here, I'm going to be talking about some of the things that I think are bigger problems. It's just something I notice a lot with characters in general in fandom, so, you know. Okay, we're kind of moving into more difficult territory, and some of these I do want to do like full-length videos just talking about this. Fandoms in general, they tend to give male characters a lot more superiority. What I mean by that is fan content of men is just much more generated in the space than most female characters, who are even more reoccurring than some of these male characters. And I noticed this a lot in the My Hero Academia fandom from 2019 to 2021, where characters who maybe had like 2 seconds of screen time ended up with like a lot of fan content generated of that character. But when you look for anything of any of the female characters, it's often really hard to find. Tying this back to Fanon, I guess what I'm trying to say here is a lot of side characters or just male characters who didn't have as much screen time get so much content of them that they feel like such a central part of the story, but when you look back, they really didn't. And this happened with a lot of characters in the MHA fandom. Looking back and rereading some of the manga recently, I realized that a lot of characters who were just staples in the fandom from 2019 to 2021 weren't even that important in the story, and shipping does play a huge role in the male superiority when it comes to fandoms. If you search up AO3 tags and the common trends in those fandoms, you're going to notice a lot of men and a lot less women. And that isn't a problem, I'd say. Or at least like a huge, huge problem. Like, real life go outside, this isn't going to be as big of an issue. It's really only dedicated or enveloped in fandom itself. But there's also just a lot of weird ways that people treat female characters in general in fandoms. And that's going to be discussed in my next point, which is the other woman in fandom. And I think the best example of this I can think of recently was Mel from Arcane, because some of the things that I've been seeing of Mel are just insane. This is in part because she has some sort of relationship developed with Jace, and that gets in the way of JVic fan art and fan content. So I think what a lot of people do is they give her a lot of negative traits or try to villainize that character in order to feel better about sidelining them to do more MLM shipping. I don't think it's wrong to ship characters together. I love shipping. It's such an integral part of fandoms in general, and I can't imagine fandom without it. And there's a lot of good that comes from it. But it's just kind of weird how people treat women characters in fandom, especially recently, and trying to villainize a female character simply because they get in the way of a ship that you really like is weird. And I wish it was talked about more, how this is just such commonplace in fandom. And I could do an entire separate video on just how bizarre it really feels, because I don't think anyone talks about it ever, or at least frequently. So that was a whole tangent. But the last one I want to talk about is one that's probably the most harmful out of everything else. It literally has harmful in my notes. Stereotyping or basing it off of caricature is something that I see a lot, especially with people of color, and it's really, really weird. Going back to Arcane, I noticed this most with Jace, Echo, and Mel. But some of the weird stereotyping that came out of that fandom, it was interesting, and I think it also comes from the fact that a lot of people of color are often masculinized for having traits that literally everybody else has. And I noticed this a lot too with like other fandoms, but that's the one I can think of off of the top of my head. I don't know why that's the first thing that comes to mind, but there's also a lot of people excusing the actions of Caitlyn because she is Wasian. It's really weird, and I think Caitlyn does fall under the do no wrong Fanon trope that I talked about earlier. These stereotypes do a lot more bad than good and harms perception of actual people in general when this happens in fandom. More often than not, a lot of these stereotypes and caricature often end up being more regressive than progressive. This is also something that I wish was talked about more in fandoms, or at least enough for mainstream discussion, but you know, you do what you gotta, and this was probably the worst of common fanon tropes that I see the most of. That wraps up just about everything I wanted to talk about today. If you have any common fanon tropes that you see in fandoms, I would love to hear about them. I'm all about discussion in my comment section. This topic just has so many different types of hyper-specific fanon tropes that come out of every fandom, because every fandom is slightly different in the way that they interact with each other. So, you know, that's all. Bye!